a storm-soaked night in San Diego, a terrified woman burst into the street, running barefoot with a dying puppy in her arms, while the abusive man chasing her screamed threats through the rain. She thought she had reached the end,
You're not going anywhere!
until a U.S. veteran stepped out of the shadows with his German shepherd at his side. Without a word, he positioned himself between her and the danger, a human shield forged by war and instinct. That single moment, one broken woman, one wounded puppy, one battle-hardened veteran, one loyal dog, set off a chain of events that would change all of their lives forever. San Diego was drowning under a rare winter storm, the kind that turned the normally warm postcard coastline into a gray wash of wind, mist, and pounding rain. The sky hung low and heavy over the city, pressing on the rooftops like a weight. Water rushed through gutters like small rivers, and the alleyways behind the industrial blocks became channels of mud and neon reflections. Behind a rundown auto repair shop on Logan Avenue, rain hammered the tin roof so loudly it sounded like distant gunfire. To most people, the storm felt miserable. To Jim Walker, it felt familiar. Storms made sense. They washed noise away, erased footsteps, and forced the world to quiet down. He could understand storms. He couldn't understand people. Jim was a U.S. veteran in his early 50s, tall, broad-shouldered, with the lean, hardened look of a man who had spent more years outside than inside. His face carried sharp, weather-beaten edges, high, angular cheekbones, a square jaw covered in two-day stubble, and tired blue eyes that always looked like they were tracking something unseen. His hair was short, shot through with gray, and cut in the same practical way he had learned in the Marines. Jim carried himself with controlled, muted strength. He rarely raised his voice, rarely wasted words, and almost never let people close. Too many decisions, too many battles, and too much loss had carved him into a man who preferred silence. Silence and his dog. Rex lay beside the small cot in Jim's room, stretched out with his head resting between his paws, ears alert even when his eyes seemed closed. Rex was a 7-year-old German shepherd with a powerful frame and thick sable coat, darker along the back and fading into tan near his legs. His amber eyes were intelligent, watchful, and always aware. He had a slight scar across his right shoulder, a reminder of the same desert that had carved Jim. In service, Rex had been the more fearless one, charging into rubble, tracking explosives, finding survivors. In retirement, he remained Jim's shadow, protector, and the single being Jim trusted without hesitation. Their living space was small, barely larger than a storage room. The paint peeled on the concrete walls, and the radiator hissed like a snake, often failing to keep the cold out. Jim rented this place because it was quiet, and the mechanic downstairs didn't mind a dog. The room had only one window, overlooking the narrow alley. That window was how Jim noticed everything. And lately, everything had been wrong. It had started about 3 weeks ago. Faint sounds through the thin wall separating Jim's room from the neighboring unit. At first he thought it was nothing, a dropped pan, a slammed drawer. But then nights turned into a pattern. Thuds. Shattered glass. A woman's voice cracking in fear, and the worst sound of all, a dog whining in pain, thin and sharp like a cry cut too short. Every time Rex heard it, his ears snapped up and he let out a low rumble in his chest. Every time, Jim placed a calming hand on Rex's back. And every time, the noise continued until it finally choked itself into silence. Jim had never seen the woman clearly, only glimpses when she left at odd hours. Her name, he gathered from the mail slot outside her door, was Lena Brooks. Lena looked to be in her late 20s or early 30s, small-framed with narrow shoulders and soft, weary features that hinted at what she might have looked like before fear carved her down. She had long, chestnut-brown hair that she kept tied in a messy knot, more out of habit than style. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and she walked with a cautious, inward posture, as if she expected the world to strike her from any direction. Her eyes, large, hazel, and filled with apologies she never spoke, always avoided direct contact. She carried herself like a shadow, trying desperately not to exist. Her husband, Roy, was the opposite in every possible way. Roy was a thick-built man in his early 40s, with a stomach that spoke of too many beers and too much sitting, but arms heavy enough to break things easily. His face was blotchy, his nose slightly crooked like it had been broken once but never properly set, and his eyes were small, dark, and perpetually irritated. He walked with the swagger of a bully, too loud, too proud, and too eager to find someone weaker to push around. His temper was legendary in the building. The landlord hated him, neighbors avoided him, and Jim, who usually kept to himself, had memorized the tone of Roy's voice. It was the tone of a man who enjoyed fear. And that was a tone Jim had learned to recognize long before he ever came home. Jim tried to ignore it. He told himself it wasn't his business. People had their private battles, their own messes, their own choices. Stepping in had consequences, something he knew too well. But every night the sounds grew worse. A bang like a chair being knocked over, a scream cut short, the whimper of a small dog, far too young and too fragile for this world. Jim could hear the fear in the dog's cry. Rex could hear it, too. And each night the tension in Jim's chest tightened a little more. He would sit on the edge of his cot, boots still on, fists clenched against his knees, listening and hating that he was listening. Tonight, though, the storm made the sounds more startling. Rain slammed into the roof, thunder rolled across the city like distant artillery, and wind howled through the alley like a warning. It was close to midnight when the first crash came, a violent, sharp noise that made Rex spring to his feet. Jim looked toward the wall. Then came another sound. A woman's voice crying out, followed by a muffled shout. Jim stood. He didn't mean to. He didn't think about it. His body simply reacted, like old instincts waking from sleep. Rex paced by the door, tail down, muscles taut. Another scream, short, panicked, cut off abruptly. Something inside Jim snapped into place. Silence had always been his companion, but this silence, the sudden suffocating stillness after violence, was the one he hated most. He grabbed his jacket. Rex was already by the door, waiting. "Stay," Jim said, though his voice lacked conviction. Rex didn't move. Not this time. Before Jim could open the door, the entire building seemed to shudder with the force of something slamming into the neighboring wall. Then, faint but clear, a small, sharp whine. A dog. Young. Hurt. Jim exhaled slowly, jaw tightening. The storm outside raged on, rain pounding like fists on metal. But inside the narrow hallway, another storm had already begun. And Jim Walker, who wanted nothing but quiet, realized the noise behind the wall was about to change everything. The storm outside had grown harsher, pounding against the metal siding of the building as if trying to break through the thin skin of the alleyway. Lightning flickered across the sky, illuminating the narrow, cluttered corridor between buildings. Jim Walker had barely taken 2 steps toward his door when a sudden crash echoed through the hallway. Louder, sharper, filled with panic. The sound wasn't muffled by walls anymore. It was coming directly from the doorway next to his. Before Jim could fully process it, the door burst open with such force that it ricocheted off the wall. Lena Brooks stumbled out into the corridor. She was barefoot, her feet red from the cold concrete, her thin frame shaking violently in the harsh yellow light of the flickering bulb overhead. Her long chestnut hair, normally tied into a knot, was loose and plastered to her face by rain and tears. She was soaking wet. He didn't even know when she had gone outside, but her drenched shirt clung to her as she clutched a tiny, trembling puppy so tightly to her chest it looked as if she were holding on to a lifeline. Buddy, no more than a few months old, was a small mixed-breed puppy with patchy tan fur and dark spots. His ribs showed through his thin frame, and his breathing was shallow and rapid, like every inhale was a battle he wasn't sure he could win. His body hung limp in her arms, except for a weak twitch of his tail. Behind Lena, a heavy shadow filled the doorway. Roy Brooks barreled out with a loud curse, one meaty hand gripping a metal rod, a rusted, crooked piece of pipe he must have grabbed from inside their apartment. Roy's bulky body nearly filled the narrow hall. He had thrown on only a stained undershirt and loose jeans, his round stomach stretching the fabric as he moved. His face was even more distorted than usual, flushed red with rage, eyes bloodshot and narrowed with drunken fury. His wet hair clung to his forehead, giving him the wild, unstable appearance of a man who had completely lost control. Jim didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, instinct taking over. Rex was already ahead of him, stepping into the hallway like a trained guardian. The German Shepherd's stance shifted, weight low, ears locked forward, fur raising slightly along his spine. His amber eyes fixed on Roy with the fierce intensity of a soldier preparing for engagement. Roy pointed the metal pipe at Lena's back as she stumbled away from him, screaming incoherently, "Get back here, Lena! I'm not done with that damn mutt! Bring it here, now!" Lena didn't look back. She clutched Buddy tighter, tears streaming down her pale face, her body moving purely out of survival and adrenaline. She nearly ran directly into Jim's chest, stopping only because Rex placed himself between her and the danger behind. Jim's voice came out low and steady, almost cold. "That's enough." Roy's attention snapped fully onto Jim. He squinted, then scoffed when recognition settled in. "You again? The quiet old Marine who minds his own damn business? Move. That's my wife and my dog." Jim didn't budge. Roy took one threatening step forward, raising the pipe. "I said move." He swung. Jim stepped in before Roy could even complete the motion. One precise twist of his wrist, a shift of his center of gravity, and he redirected Roy's momentum. The Q-bin's movement was controlled, efficient, and dangerously smooth. In one fluid motion, Jim seized Roy's wrist, locked the joint, and pulled him forward while kicking out Roy's leg. The larger man collapsed onto the wet hallway floor with a thud that shook the walls, dropping the pipe as a hoarse grunt escaped him. Jim held Roy down for a moment. Not with anger, just trained control. Roy tried to push himself up but failed, growling through clenched teeth. Jim released him only when he was certain Roy wouldn't get up immediately. Lena stood frozen several feet away, holding Buddy close to her chest, trembling so hard her teeth chattered. Her hazel eyes darted between the men, wide and terrified, but filled with a flicker of something else, relief or maybe disbelief that someone had finally stood between her and danger. Jim turned to her. "Come with me. Now." His voice was firm, not harsh, a command, but one given with purpose. Lena hesitated for just a breath, looking down at Buddy, then at the open hallway behind her, as if she expected Roy to rise like a nightmare that would never end. But Jim's presence, Rex's protective stance, the storm outside, and the desperation in her own chest made the answer undeniable. She nodded. Jim didn't wait for Roy to recover. He placed a steadying hand at Lena's back and guided her down the hallway. Rex reversed his steps, keeping his face toward Roy, backing out slowly to ensure the threat was still visible and controlled. Buddy whimpered again in Lena's arms. The sound was so faint it almost disappeared beneath the thunder outside. They moved quickly toward the back exit leading to the repair shop. Rain blasted in when Jim pushed the metal door open. The storm's cold wind hit Lena's face, but she didn't complain. She held Buddy tighter, trying to shield him from the rain. Roy appeared at the end of the hallway. He was slower, still winded, but his rage hadn't cooled. "Lena!" he shouted, voice cracking. "You think he's going to save you? You think you can run?" Jim didn't look back. Rex growled, a deep, resonant warning that made Roy freeze mid-step. Only then did Jim shut the metal door behind them. Inside the back storage room of the auto shop, dimly lit by a single buzzing lamp, Jim quickly locked the door and turned to Lena. "You're safe here." He pointed to a corner where stacks of old tires were pushed aside to create a makeshift dry space. "Sit down. Let me check the pup." Lena crouched down on the cold concrete floor. Her wet hair clung to her cheeks. Her lips were almost blue from the cold and fear. She gently loosened her grip on Buddy. The puppy whimpered again, a sound that cut through Jim's chest sharper than any blade. Jim knelt beside them. Even though his hands were large, rough, and calloused, he handled the tiny dog with extraordinary gentleness. "He's hurt pretty bad," Jim said quietly. "But he's alive, that's what matters." Lena swallowed hard, her voice barely audible. He was all I could save." Rex sat close, positioning himself in front of the door like a silent sentry. His ears flicked at every noise, ready to react. Jim glanced at Lena, really looked at her. Up close, she appeared even more fragile, with purple bruises blooming along her arms, scratches on her wrists, and a haunted expression in her eyes that spoke of years of endurance rather than hours. She looked like someone who had forgotten what safety felt like. "You stay with me tonight," Jim said. "Both of you." Lena's hands trembled. Why help me?" Jim didn't have a long answer. He wasn't the type. He simply said, "Because you needed someone, and because I know what it's like when nobody comes." A quiet sob escaped Lena as she bowed her head. Buddy pressed his tiny muzzle against her palm. Rex moved closer, gently nudging her arm. And in the middle of the storm, in a small concrete room behind a forgotten auto shop, a woman, a wounded puppy, a veteran, and a loyal German shepherd took their first step out of chaos. Jim exhaled, steady and certain. "You're safe here? More secure?" The storm outside raged harder as Jim Walker guided Lena Brooks and the injured puppy into the back storage room of the auto shop. The space was dimly lit by a single humming industrial lamp hanging from exposed pipes, casting long shadows across the concrete floor. The room had once been a simple storage area for tires and abandoned tools, but over the years Jim had quietly turned it into something more, a personal bunker, a sanctuary from the remnants of war that still lived in his bones. The space smelled faintly of engine oil and old wood, but there was also a hint of something softer. Rex's blanket, washed so often that it no longer held any scent but safety. Rex entered first, his sable fur slick with rain, shaking droplets onto the floor as he positioned himself near the corner. His posture was alert, though his eyes tracked Lena gently, almost protectively. The German shepherd's presence filled the room with an unspoken assurance. His ears flicked forward as he watched Jim move. Jim closed the heavy metal door behind them, sliding the deadbolt into place. The wind outside howled against the panels, but inside the room the storm sounded distant, like it belonged to another world. Lena stood near the center of the room, shivering uncontrollably, clutching Buddy to her chest as though he were the only thing keeping her anchored to the earth. The puppy's breathing was shallow, his small chest rising and falling in uneven rhythm, his light tan fur patchy and dirty from neglect. "Sit here," Jim said, guiding Lena toward a stack of clean folded blankets he kept in the corner. His voice remained calm, firm but gentle, the tone of a man who had seen chaos far worse than this. He grabbed one of the blankets and draped it over her shoulders. Lena flinched at the unexpected warmth, her hazel eyes widening as she realized just how cold she had become. Jim crouched beside her. Up close, Lena's appearance revealed even more of the life she had endured. She had a delicate bone structure, a narrow jaw, thin lips, and long lashes that were wet from tears and rain. Her skin was pale, almost translucent under the harsh light, with bruises scattered along her wrists and neck. Her hair, a long chestnut wave normally tied back, now clung to her cheeks in damp strands. She looked small, exhausted, and defeated, yet somewhere in her expression was a faint, stubborn spark of survival. "Let me see him," Jim said, motioning toward Buddy. Lena hesitated for a moment, clutching the tiny puppy closer, as though unsure whether to release him. But then she looked at Jim, at his steady hands, at Rex lying calmly nearby, and she slowly extended Buddy toward him. Jim lifted Buddy with the same care he would use for a wounded soldier. His hands were large, calloused, and scarred from years of service, yet incredibly gentle as he laid the puppy on a folded towel. Jim examined Buddy's injuries with the practiced precision of someone who knew exactly what to look for. The pup had a deep bruise along his rib cage, likely from being kicked, and his breathing wheezed unevenly. There were abrasions along his hind legs, a small cut above his eye, and his ribs showed through thin fur from chronic starvation. "He's in rough shape," Jim murmured, his voice low. "But he's fighting." Lena pressed a trembling hand to her mouth. "Roy, he said Buddy was worthless. He said he would—" Her voice cracked. I just couldn't let him." Jim didn't ask for more details. He had heard enough to understand. He opened an old metal first aid box, one he had acquired from a surplus shop, still carrying faint military markings. Inside were rolls of gauze, antiseptic wipes, pain relief cream, medical tape, and small vials of antibiotics he kept for emergencies. Jim's movements were smooth and efficient. He cleaned the wounds carefully, wrapped a light bandage around Buddy's ribs, and checked his temperature with the back of his hand. Rex shifted closer and rested his head near Lena's leg. His warm amber eyes lifted toward her, observing her trembling frame with quiet understanding. Lena looked down at him, startled at first, then slowly placed a hand on his thick fur. Rex didn't move away. Instead, he exhaled softly and leaned in just enough to let her know she wasn't alone. Tears finally welled in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered to Rex, barely able to speak. "Thank you for staying." Jim glanced up, watching her with an expression that softened slightly at the edges. He wasn't used to speaking about emotions, but he recognized the moment. He had seen the look on countless faces, civilians, soldiers, children in war zones, the look of someone who had been alone for far too long. "You did the right thing getting him out of there," Jim said softly. "Took guts." Lena lowered her gaze. "I didn't think, I just moved." Jim nodded. "Sometimes that's how survival works." He finished cleaning Buddy's wounds and placed another blanket over the small, trembling body. The puppy gave a tiny whimper before slowly relaxing into the warmth. Lena's breathing slowed. Her shoulders fell as exhaustion consumed her. "You should get some rest," Jim said gently. "I don't—" Lena swallowed. "I don't know if I can." That's what the room is for, Jim replied. It's safe. She stared at him for a long moment, as if weighing the truth of his words. Jim didn't pressure her. He simply sat down against the wall near Rex, keeping a respectful distance while ensuring she knew he wasn't leaving. Eventually, fatigue won. Lena's eyes fluttered, her head drooping as she leaned slightly to the side. Rex, sensing her weakening posture, adjusted himself and lay beside her, gently pressing his warm body against her leg. The contact steadied her, and with a small sigh, she finally let herself lie down on the blanket-covered floor. She curled up delicately, one hand still touching Buddy, who slept beneath another layer of warmth. Jim watched over them silently. He didn't sleep. He sat upright, his back straight, his senses sharp. His gaze swept the room every few seconds out of habit. The storm outside cracked thunder again, and he tensed. The small storage room carried echoes, far too similar to the temporary shelters he had used overseas during his deployments, where every distant noise could be the difference between life and death. Rex lifted his head a little, watching Jim with understanding in his eyes. He recognized his handler's tension. Jim nodded once, reassuring Rex he was fine. The dog lowered his head again beside Lena. Hours passed. The storm eased, but Jim didn't relax. He stayed seated, guarding the door with unwavering patience, a silent sentinel standing between the woman and her nightmares. For the first time in years, Lena slept without screaming, and Jim Walker, battle-worn but unbroken, kept watch, just as he always had. The storm had died down to a gentle drizzle by the time midnight settled over the auto shop. The distant hum of passing cars faded, leaving the world outside quiet and empty. Inside the back storage room, the dim industrial bulb continued to flicker softly, casting long shadows over the floor where Lena Brooks slept, curled beneath a worn blanket. Buddy lay a few inches from her hand, the little puppy's breathing steady now beneath the bandages Jim had carefully wrapped around his bruised ribs. Rex lay close to both of them, his body positioned protectively between the sleeping woman and the door, his head resting on his paws but his ears alert to even the faintest shift in the air. Jim Walker sat against the far wall, his back straight, arms resting loosely on his knees. His eyes remained open long after exhaustion urged them to close. He had spent years training himself to stay awake through worse nights. The room around him carried the same atmosphere as forward operating bases he had once slept in. Small, quiet, but too fragile to trust completely. The whirring bulb, the distant tapping of rain, and the soft breathing sounds around him formed a rhythm that, for anyone else, might have been calming. But for Jim, silence was never just silence. It was something waiting. He glanced again at Lena. Her face, though relaxed in sleep, carried the marks of everything she had survived. Slight shadows beneath her eyes, faint bruises along her jawline, and lips pressed together in a way that showed her mind was never truly at ease. Her long chestnut hair fanned slightly over the blanket, tangled from rain and stress. Even in sleep, her fingers twitched, as if preparing for impact. And then, the nightmare hit. It began with a small sound, a strangled breath, sharp and thin. Then Lena's body jerked, her hand tightened over empty air, searching for something she could not find. A second passed, then two, before her entire frame tightened, and she let out a small whimper, her eyelids fluttering in terror. "No, please, don't," she gasped, her voice barely audible. Jim's eyes snapped into full alert. He didn't move yet. He never rushed towards someone in the middle of a nightmare. He had seen too many soldiers lash out in confusion when someone tried to wake them too quickly. Lena twisted, one hand rising as if to shield her face. Stop! Please stop!" Her voice broke into a terrified cry. Buddy whimpered softly, sensing the distress, his tiny body shifting weakly. Rex lifted his head immediately, ears sharp, eyes locked onto Lena with canine intuition. The German shepherd stood slowly and stepped closer, tail low, posture soft. He nudged her leg once, unsure if she would wake. But the nightmare only grew worse. "No, Roy, don't!" Lena screamed, curling herself into a ball on the blanket. Jim rose instantly, but he didn't shout her name. He didn't grab her shoulders. He didn't shake her awake. He crouched down slowly, beside her, keeping a safe distance so she would not feel trapped. "Lena," Jim said, his voice low, deep, steady, a tone he once used on broken soldiers halfway across the world. "You're in the shop. You're here. You're safe." Her breathing didn't slow. Her hands clawed desperately at the blanket. Jim reached out, but not to shake her awake. He placed 2 fingers gently on the concrete floor near her shoulder, close enough she would sense his presence, far enough she wouldn't feel cornered. "You're with me," he said again, firmer now, letting the words anchor the air. "No one'll hurt you here." Lena's eyes flew open, but she didn't see him. Not yet. Her gaze darted wildly, pupils trembling as if she expected Roy to lunge toward her from the shadows. Her breath came out in short, panicked bursts. Jim didn't move. "Look at me," he said softly. Her gaze finally shifted, blurry at first, then focused on Jim's face. His rough jawline, his stubble, his steady blue eyes, the outline of his military jacket. They all formed the opposite of Roy's presence. "You're safe," he repeated. "Right here." Tears spilled down Lena's cheeks. She covered her mouth with her hands as a choked sob escaped her. "I'm sorry," she whispered, shaking. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to wake anyone, I didn't." Jim shook his head. "Don't apologize." Her breath hitched. "You survived something," Jim continued. "Nightmares come with that." She covered her face with both hands, her body trembling violently. "I thought I was back there, I thought—" She couldn't finish the sentence. Her shoulders collapsed, breaking under the weight of memories. Jim let her cry. Rex walked forward and gently pressed the top of his head against Lena's leg. The German shepherd's warm weight, the steady pressure, pulled her slowly back to the present. She lowered her hands and saw Rex watching her, eyes deep amber and understanding. She reached out with trembling fingers and rested her hand on his fur. Buddy gave a weak chirp and tried to inch closer. Lena reached for him, scooping him gently against her chest. "I'm okay," she whispered shakily, though the words were more for herself than anyone else. Jim sat beside her now, though he still maintained a respectful distance. Up close, Lena could see the thick veins along his forearms, the scars etched across his knuckles, the hard life that shaped every line of his face. Yet his expression held nothing but calmness, no frustration, no discomfort, no judgment, only recognition. Jim had seen this before. He saw it in the barracks, in the makeshift shelters, in the tents under mortar fire. Soldiers waking from the past, still bleeding memories that weren't visible on their bodies. Lena wiped her cheeks. Do you ever get nightmares?" Jim hesitated. Not long, but enough for her to know the answer before he spoke. "I used to," he said quietly. "Still do sometimes." Lena looked at him, her eyes searching. "What do you do when it happens?" Jim leaned back slightly, resting his hands on the floor. "I sit up," he said. "I wait it out. And if someone's nearby, I remind myself of where I am." Lena swallowed. "Like you did for me?" Jim nodded. Silence fell between them. Not awkward, not heavy, just real. Buddy nestled into her lap. Rex lay beside her, and Lena finally took a deep breath without shaking. "You and Buddy," Jim said after a moment. "You're survivors." Lena blinked at him. "Like you?" Jim's gaze drifted toward the floor, then to the metal door, then back to her. "Yeah," he said at last. "Like me." For the first time since entering Jim's safe room, Lena allowed herself to lean her back fully against the wall. Not bracing, not flinching, just resting. Rex stayed beside her, a silent guardian. Jim watched her closely, making sure she had fully returned to herself before shifting his gaze back toward the door. The room grew quiet again. Lena breathed evenly now. Buddy drifted back to sleep. Rex closed his eyes while staying alert. Jim stayed awake the rest of the night. And when dawn finally crept beneath the metal door, the safe room felt different. Not just a shelter, but the fragile beginning of something healing. The first light of dawn filtered weakly into the back room of the auto shop, slipping through the narrow vents above the concrete wall. It cast a pale glow across the floor where Lena Brooks sat huddled beneath her blanket, Buddy asleep in her lap, and Rex lying close enough that his warm breath brushed her arm. Jim Walker watched the scene quietly as he sipped lukewarm coffee from an old metal mug. He had been awake the entire night, but the exhaustion didn't show on his face. His features, sharp jawline, faint stubble, the tired blue eyes of a man who had lived more than one life, remained steady and alert. Lena slowly blinked awake, her lashes fluttering as she adjusted to the muted morning light. For a moment she looked confused, uncertain of where she was. Then she saw Buddy nestled against her, Rex's large frame resting beside her, and Jim sitting at the far end of the room. A soft breath escaped her lips, partly relief, partly disbelief that the nightmare wasn't still happening. "Morning," Jim said, keeping his tone even and calm so she wouldn't startle. Lena nodded, brushing her chestnut hair away from her face. She looked fragile. Thin wrists, bruises fading but still visible, pale skin under the harsh industrial light. But there was something new in her eyes, a flicker of steadiness. Buddy stretched weakly and pressed his tiny body closer to her. Rex responded by placing one paw protectively over the puppy, curling slightly as if shielding him from the world. Jim set the mug aside and rose to his feet. "We need to talk about something important." Lena stiffened slightly, her fingers tightening around Buddy. "About Roy?" "In a way," Jim replied. "About what happens if he finds you again." Lena swallowed hard. Fear flickered across her face. "Jim, I can't do that again, I can't." Her voice cracked. "That's why," Jim said gently, "I'm going to teach you how to defend yourself." Lena blinked in surprise, her expression a mix of fear and uncertainty. "Me? I'm not strong. I can't fight someone like him." Jim shook his head. "It's not about strength. It's about leverage, awareness, and commitment. Most people don't expect resistance from someone your size. That's your advantage." Lena looked down at her small hands, then at Jim's large, scarred ones. "I don't know if I can." Jim crouched beside her, keeping a respectful distance. "You can, because you're still here, and that tells me more about your strength than anything else." Rex lifted his head, sensing the shift in the room. Buddy let out a tiny whimper, nudging into Lena's palm. Jim stood and stepped into the center of the room. "Come on, slowly. We'll go at your pace." Lena hesitated, then very carefully shifted Buddy onto Rex's belly. The German Shepherd adjusted instantly, curling around the puppy, creating a warm nest of tan and sable fur. Buddy let out a content sigh and snuggled deeper. Seeing them like that, a strong protector wrapped around a fragile life, gave Lena enough courage to stand. She walked to Jim, her bare feet cold against the concrete. She stood several feet away, arms wrapped around herself. Jim nodded. Good. First lesson. Breaking a wrist grab. Most abusers start by grabbing. It's a control tactic. He extended his hand slowly. I'm going to take your wrist. Gently. You ready? Lena inhaled shakily but nodded. Jim took her wrist lightly, his touch soft but secure. Now, don't pull away. Rotate toward the thumb. That's the weak point. Then pull down. Use your whole body. Lena tried. It didn't work. She tried again. Still nothing. Her fingers trembled. It's okay, Jim said softly. Again. She rotated harder this time. Her breath hitched. She tried once more, teeth clenched. On the fourth attempt, she broke his grip. Her eyes widened, a spark of shock and pride. Jim nodded once. Good. Again. They repeated the motion. Again. And again. Lena's movements grew cleaner, sharper. Her breath steadied. Her stance, though small, became rooted. After several minutes, Jim stepped back. Next, escaping a chokehold. This part might be hard. Lena froze. Her pupils dilated. Choke? Hold? Jim raised both hands slowly, palms visible. I will not touch your neck. Ever. I'll show the movement on myself first. He demonstrated. Tucking the chin, shifting weight, using the forearm to break the grip, stepping aside. He performed each step slowly, talking her through it. Then he said, Your turn. I'll place my hands on your shoulders only, nothing more. If you want to stop, say stop. Lena nodded, throat tight. Jim placed his large hands gently on her shoulders. The touch was firm but protective, not restraining. Now, he said quietly, imagine someone trying to control your space. You step to the side, push the arm off, and strike with the heel of your palm. He guided her through the motions without rushing. The first strike was weak, the second was shaky. By the third, her palm met Jim's open hand with a soft but determined thud. Jim nodded. Good. Again. She repeated the movement, breathing harder, pushing more forcefully. Suddenly, midway through her next strike, her breath caught. Her chest tightened, her eyes filled with tears. Jim froze instantly, dropping his hands. Lena? She stared at her own small hands, trembling violently. For years, I just let him. I let him hit me, shove me, scream at me. I just stood there. I didn't fight. I didn't... Her voice broke into sobs she tried to swallow. Jim didn't hesitate. He stepped forward and gently wrapped his arms around her, not grabbing, not pulling, just enveloping her in steady, unyielding warmth. She collapsed into him, pressing her forehead against his chest as the tears came in heavy, anguished waves. I'm sorry, she sobbed. I'm sorry, I wasn't stronger. Jim shook his head. You survived. That's strength. Her hands clutched at his jacket. I was so scared. I know, Jim whispered, resting one large hand against the back of her head. But you're safe, and you're learning, and you're not alone. Behind them, Rex stood up and walked closer, nuzzling Lena's hip with his nose. Buddy peeped his tiny head out from the blanket covering Rex's belly and blinked at her with wide, trusting eyes. Lena cried harder, overwhelmed by the sight. 4 living beings, her, Jim, Rex, and Buddy, huddled together like pieces of a broken puzzle finally finding where they belonged. Jim held her until her sobs softened into exhausted breaths. When she finally pulled away, her eyes were red, but her voice was steadier. Can we keep practicing? She asked. Jim smiled, a rare, small curve of his lips. Yeah, we can. And as the morning slowly stretched into day, the safe room, once a cold, lonely bunker, became something warmer, something fragile, something real. It became the beginning of a home. The following morning arrived with a gray, muted sky. the kind that made the entire city feel drained of color. The storm had finally passed, leaving the streets damp and reflecting the pale daylight like broken shards of glass. Jim Walker stood near the back door of the auto shop, securing the straps of a small military-style backpack. His movements were focused and deliberate. His jaw was set, the faint stubble along his cheeks catching the soft light. His blue eyes were sharper than usual, carrying a silent determination. Lena Brooks sat on a wooden crate nearby, Buddy curled against her stomach inside her jacket for warmth. Her hair, still slightly damp from the night before, fell loosely around her pale face. She looked tired, fragile even, but her hazel eyes held a subtle steadiness now. Underneath the thin sweater Jim had given her, she looked smaller than she actually was, but when she glanced up at him, there was no mistaking the quiet resolve she was beginning to build. Rex stood between them, alert as always. The 7-year-old German shepherd's sable fur bristled slightly as he listened for unfamiliar sounds. His muscular frame coiled with anticipation, instincts already sensing the tension in the air. Jim zipped his backpack and met Lena's gaze. "We're moving to a safer place. A friend owes me a favor. Empty apartment. No one knows the address. You'll rest easier there." Lena nodded slowly, though her fingers tightened protectively around Buddy. "I trust you," she whispered. It was the first time she said the words aloud. Jim didn't respond verbally, but a subtle nod showed he understood the weight of that trust. He led them through the back entrance, Rex keeping pace at Lena's side. The air in the alleyway tasted cold and metallic. Jim scanned the surroundings carefully before motioning for them to follow. The apartment wasn't far, 3 blocks and a turn, then through a side alley, but Jim had learned long ago that trouble didn't need distance to find someone. It only needed opportunity. They reached the underground parking area beneath the building faster than expected. The concrete walls were cracked, lined with pipes overhead, and dim lights flickered inconsistently, casting eerie shadows that stretched like long fingers across the space. Jim walked ahead, eyes scanning every dark corner. Rex stayed close to Lena, muscles tense. Lena adjusted her grip on Buddy. "Is anyone else living here?" "Not on this floor," Jim answered without looking back. "Most of the building's empty. Owner's renovating." His voice was steady, reassuring, but Lena noticed the way his shoulders stayed tight and the way his right hand hovered closer to his belt where he kept a small tactical flashlight. Jim slowed, lifting one hand slightly. Rex froze instantly. Lena's breath caught. Something was wrong. A soft metallic clatter echoed from near the stairwell door. Too sharp to be accidental. Too deliberate. Jim's eyes narrowed. "Lena," he said quietly, "stay behind Rex." She moved without hesitation, clutching Buddy closer. The stairwell door swung open. Roy Brooks stepped out. He looked worse than the night before, his large frame hunched, his stomach pushing against a wrinkled shirt, and his face flushed with a sickening combination of rage and alcohol. His short, dark hair stuck to his sweaty forehead. His eyes, bloodshot and unfocused, zeroed in on Lena like a predator spotting prey. "So this is where you ran off to," Roy hissed. His voice cracked with venom. In his right hand was a length of metal chain, still smeared with rust. In the other, a folded pocket knife. "Thought you could hide?" Lena stumbled backward, instinctively shielding Buddy. Rex growled, a deep, vibrating warning that echoed through the empty garage. Jim stepped forward immediately, his posture shifting from guarded to full tactical readiness. "Roy," he said coldly, "back away. Now." Roy laughed, a sound dripping with madness. "You think you can take what's mine? Think you can turn my wife against me? You don't know a damn thing about us?" "She's not property," Jim said, voice calm but icy, "and she's leaving with me." Roy lunged. It happened fast, a sudden explosion of movement fueled by anger rather than skill. But Rex moved faster. The German Shepherd launched forward, placing his body directly between Roy and Lena. Roy swung the chain wildly. It struck Rex across the shoulder with a sharp crack. The dog absorbed the hit, snarled, and forced Roy to stumble back. "Rex!" Lena screamed, reaching toward him. Jim cut off her movement with one hand, his voice sharp. "Stay down!" Roy staggered, then turned his fury on Jim. "You son of a—" he charged, knife flashing. Jim sidestepped, grabbing Roy's wrist mid-swing. With a swift twist and downward pressure, Jim forced the knife to the ground, sending it skittering across the concrete. Roy roared, swinging the chain again. Jim blocked with his forearm, the metal biting into his sleeve, leaving a mark. Jim shoved Roy backward, creating distance. Roy stumbled but didn't fall. His face contorted. "I'll kill you! I'll kill all of you!" He rushed again. But this time, Jim met him head-on. He caught Roy's arm, slammed his palm into Roy's elbow to destabilize him, then hooked a leg behind Roy's knee. Roy collapsed onto the concrete floor with a grunt, the chain slipping from his hand. Jim pinned him with expert precision, one knee between Roy's shoulders, forearm locking Roy's arm in a controlled hold. Roy struggled violently, but Jim didn't budge. "You're done," Jim said, voice calm, but leaving no room for argument. A sharp beep echoed through the garage. Jim hadn't come unprepared. Before they left the auto shop, he had used a discreet emergency signal, one tied to a local officer he once helped years ago. The police had been monitoring the situation ever since. Red and blue lights splashed across the far wall as two officers stormed into the parking garage. The first officer, a tall man with graying hair and a firm jawline, aimed his flashlight at the struggling Roy. The second officer moved to secure the area. "Walker?" the first officer called out. "You signaled?" "Yeah," Jim replied without shifting his weight. "Suspect assaulted the woman again, armed." Roy howled and tried to fight back. "She's my wife! She's mine!" "She's not yours!" the officer snapped, moving in. "Hands behind your back!" Jim released Roy's arm only when the officer had full control. Within seconds, Roy was handcuffed, dragged up to his feet, and shoved toward the patrol car outside. He kept screaming, curses echoing through the concrete garage until the door slammed shut and his voice faded. Lena sank to her knees, hugging Buddy as tears streamed down her cheeks. Not of fear this time, but of release, hope, safety, something she hadn't felt in years. Rex limped slightly toward her, nudging her shoulder gently. She held his face in her trembling hands, whispering, "Thank you. Thank you." Jim approached them slowly. "You're safe now," he said quietly. Lena looked up at him, not with fear, but gratitude so deep it nearly broke her. For the first time in a long time, the world felt survivable. The morning sun in North Park was nothing like the rain-soaked chaos of the underground garage a week before. It cut through the tree-lined street in soft, gentle rays, warming the sidewalks and glinting off the rows of vintage apartment buildings from the 1940s. The neighborhood felt quieter, calmer, almost suspended in its own bubble of peace. The Pacific breeze carried the scent of jasmine from a nearby garden, weaving through the air like something fragile and hopeful. For Lena, this sunlight felt unreal, as if her body had not yet caught up to the idea that life around her could be soft again. She stepped out of the passenger side of Jim's old truck, cradling Buddy, who now walked steadier, though she still held him protectively. Buddy was a tiny golden puppy, roughly 4 months old, still thin but no longer shaking with fear. His short fur had regained its sheen, and the bruises on his ribs were fading beneath soft bandages Jim had changed daily. His dark eyes followed every movement of Lena with unshakable attachment. Rex, the 7-year-old sable German shepherd, leaped gracefully from the truck bed and landed beside her, his posture alert but not tense. His coat caught the sunlight in streaks of tan and black, and the scar from the ambush, a thin line along his shoulder, had already begun to heal. Rex walked slightly ahead, as if guiding Lena to the future waiting behind the new apartment door. Jim Walker locked the truck and slung a black duffel bag over his shoulder. At 50, Jim had the presence of someone who had lived 3 lifetimes' worth of battles, both foreign and domestic. His hair, cut short, showed streaks of gray at the temples, and his face bore sharp lines carved by sun, wind, and loss. His expression, though stern at rest, softened when he looked at the small trio heading toward the building's entrance. His steps were steady, controlled, the walk of a man who had spent decades moving through danger, but now allowed himself to exhale. The apartment they reached was on the 2nd floor, Unit 2B, with a small balcony draped in soft vines. It was nothing fancy, but it was safe. That alone made it priceless. Jim unlocked the door and pushed it open. "Go ahead," he said quietly. Lena stepped inside, and her breath caught in her throat. The place was small but warm. Hardwood floors, sunlight spilling across a beige sofa, a yellow rug in the kitchen, and a bedroom with crisp white sheets neatly folded. Nothing in this place smelled like fear. Nothing felt like a trap. It felt like a beginning. She exhaled shakily, as if releasing years of tension in one breath. Buddy squirmed happily and trotted forward, sniffing the rug as if claiming it. Rex followed with measured steps, circling the perimeter like a silent guardian. For the first time since they met, Lena wasn't trembling. Jim watched her take it all in, then placed the duffel bag down near the sofa. Inside were simple necessities: blankets, a first aid kit, spare clothes he thought she might need. Jim never did anything halfway. "Everything you need for the next month is already stocked," Jim said. His voice was calm, but something in it carried weight, a seriousness that made Lena turn toward him. He handed her a small envelope containing keys, a prepaid bank card, and a set of documents. "This is your place now. You're off the grid. Safe." His words were steady, factual, but underneath them was a quiet emotion he rarely let out. Lena opened the envelope slowly. Her hands trembled, not from fear this time, but something deeper. At the bottom was her new ID, a new beginning captured in plastic. Name: Lena Walker. She looked at the name for a long moment, then looked up, her hazel eyes shimmering. She swallowed hard. "Jim, I didn't choose this name because I wanted to hide." Her voice cracked as she spoke. She stepped closer, her shoulders no longer slumped, her posture straighter. "I chose it because—" She paused, tears gathering. "Because you and Rex. You saved me, and Buddy. You gave me more than safety. You gave me a family. The first one I've ever really had." Jim froze. For years he had lived behind emotional walls so thick even he didn't know how to breach them. He tried to reply, but words did not come. Instead, he placed a steady hand on her shoulder, warm, grounding, gentle in a way that contrasted sharply with the rest of his hardened exterior. Rex approached and lightly bumped Lena's leg with his snout, then sat beside her, tail thumping the floor once. Buddy toddled forward and curled beneath Lena's feet, as if settling into the final piece of a puzzle. For a moment, there was silence. But it wasn't empty. It was full. Jim finally spoke, his voice rough but steady. "If you're ever in danger, if anything feels wrong, you call me. I don't care where I am." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a second object, a rugged black satellite phone. "This number connects directly to me," he said. "No one else." Lena took it reverently, cupping it with both hands. She understood what it meant, not just safety, but trust. He trusted her with part of his world, a part he didn't share with anyone. "I'll call," she whispered. "I promise." They unpacked slowly. Buddy curled up in a sunlit patch on the floor. Rex remained near the door, lying down but alert, always watching. When the last drawer was filled and the last blanket folded, Jim stood near the exit. The moment hung between them, heavy, meaningful, unfamiliar. Jim adjusted his jacket, cleared his throat, and said softly, "You're home now, Lena." She stepped toward him, her voice tender. "And you're part of that home. You and Rex always will be." Something flickered across his face, surprise, gratitude, and something else he wasn't ready to name. Then a sound broke the tension. Rex rose from the floor, walked over, and sat directly between them, tail sweeping in slow arcs, looking up as if demanding acknowledgement that this moment belonged to all three of them. Jim smiled, a small, rare smile that softened his entire face. He rested a hand on Rex's head, then looked at Lena again. "You take care of yourself," he said. "And of them." "I will," she whispered, "and we'll be waiting." Jim stepped backward toward the door. The sunlight from outside framed him like a silhouette. He looked at Lena one last time, memorizing her face, committing her smile to memory, then nodded once and walked out. The lock clicked softly behind him. Lena stood still for several seconds, letting the quiet wrap around her like warmth. Buddy nudged her calf. Rex brushed his head into her hand. She knelt, wrapped one arm around Rex and the other around Buddy, and whispered into their fur, voice trembling with joy. "This is our life now, our second chance." The sunlight drifted across the floor, bright and gentle, the first true sunrise of her new life. Sometimes miracles don't arrive with thunder or blinding light. Sometimes they come quietly, through a moment when someone simply chooses to stand up. That day in the library, it wasn't only Emily who was saved. It was everyone who witnessed it. And perhaps God doesn't always send angels with wings. Sometimes he sends a tired veteran and a loyal dog to remind us that goodness is still alive in this world. In everyday life, we may not step into danger the way Jim did, but even a small act, a gentle word, a firm stop, a choice to care, can change someone's story. God sees every act of courage, and he blesses those who choose what is right, even when no one is watching. If this story touched your heart, please share it so the light can spread in a world that still struggles with darkness. Leave a comment and tell others what you believe about true strength. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this. And may God bless, protect, and watch over every person watching this video.